What if something sitting in your house right now, something you never think twice about, is leaving a door open that you would never have opened on purpose? A door you don't even know exists? August 24 is almost here, the Feast of Saint Bartholomew the Apostle. And Saint Teresa of Jesus left behind a warning about one very specific object, one that almost no Christian household connects to this day on the liturgical calendar. That object might be in your kitchen right now, on a wall, in a drawer you open every morning without really looking at it, without ever stopping to ask what that small corner of your home is actually holding. Do you have it in your house right now? Keep listening. That question comes from a woman who spent years learning to read her own home the way someone reads a spiritual map, corner by corner. Saint Teresa of Jesus discovered something about this date that goes deeper than simply clearing an object off your dining table. She discovered what door stays open in your home while that object sits there, catching the kitchen light tonight, unnoticed, while nobody suspects what it represents. Before we go on, look around you and write in the comments what sharp object you have sitting out in your house right now. You don't have to put it away yet. Just name it calmly. Naming it is already the first step in all of this. What you're about to hear was set aside for this exact night, and every word here depends completely on the one before it. August 24th has held a fixed place on the Church's liturgical calendar for centuries. It's not one of those minor dates that slips by unnoticed between one solemnity and the next. It's the day the whole Church remembers Saint Bartholomew, one of the 12, a man who walked beside Christ through all 3 years of his public life, and who carried that closeness all the way to the end of his own life on earth. The Apostle's full name, according to the oldest tradition, faithfully preserved by the early fathers of the Church, was Nathaniel Bartholomew. That name first appears in the Gospel of John under an old leafy fig tree when Philip brings him to Jesus with a simple line. We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Nathanael, skeptical at first, asks whether anything good can come out of Nazareth. Christ looks at him and says something that has echoed down the centuries since. Behold an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no guile. That line isn't a small detail if you want to understand who Saint Bartholomew was. Christ described him before Bartholomew had said a single word about himself. He described his interior, the cleanness of his heart, a transparency the man himself probably didn't even know he had. And that quality, a man without deceit, without a mask, without guile, is exactly what the Church still holds up every August 24th as a concrete spiritual model for anyone listening. Among the 12, Bartholomew held a quiet place. His recorded words are few. No epistle of his made it into the canon we know, and his presence in Scripture stays mostly in the background behind Peter or John. What we're told about him is brief, almost silent, and yet Christian tradition places him among the apostles who carried the gospel the farthest, geographically speaking, into lands that today correspond to Armenia and parts of India, according to the oldest accounts preserved by church historians like Eusebius of Caesarea. That missionary journey, long and dangerous, crossing mountains and the borders of kingdoms that barely knew the name of Rome, ended in a martyrdom the Church remembers on this exact date. And here is where the liturgical calendar stops being a mere historical fact and starts touching the life of the Christian home directly. Because Bartholomew's death wasn't just another violent death among the many the first witnesses of Christ suffered. It was marked by one specific instrument, one that tradition preserved with a detail other apostolic martyrdoms didn't preserve with the same precision. And that detail, carried through generations in the popular piety of different Christian regions, eventually gave rise to a household custom whose true origin almost no Catholic today actually knows. Saint Teresa of Jesus, who lived deeply rooted in the liturgical calendar of her own time, understood every apostles' feast as a date carrying real spiritual weight, not as a simple historical commemoration. In the book of her Foundations, she describes organizing the life of her convents around the rhythm of the saints' feasts and teaching her sisters to prepare their hearts before each one, especially when the feast belonged to an apostle who had poured out his blood for Christ. For Saint Teresa of Jesus, an apostolic martyr's feast wasn't only a day of spiritual joy, it was also a day of examination. A day the soul had to ask itself how ready it truly was to give up something, anything, for the same faith that apostle had given his last drop of blood for. And that examination, based on what she wrote in different parts of her work, extended to the home itself, to the physical space where a Christian family lived out its faith day after day. This way of understanding the liturgical feasts, so typical of 16th century Spain, so rooted in the daily life of convents and Christian households of that era, is what makes it possible to understand why a warning about one specific object came to be tied so precisely to this exact date. Behind that connection lie centuries of popular piety, built on solid doctrinal ground, on the living memory of how this apostle died, and on what that death meant to anyone who remembered it seriously. And here is where the thread gets more concrete. Because the instrument tradition associates with Bartholomew's martyrdom didn't stay locked away in books of church history. Over the centuries, especially in the popular piety of Spain and other deeply Catholic regions, that instrument became tied to a practical warning about the home, one that reached Saint Teresa of Jesus' own writing with a clarity that surprises anyone reading it for the first time. What instrument was it exactly? Why did popular piety slowly, generation after generation, end up carrying that precise detail of the martyrdom all the way into the kitchen, onto the wall, into the drawer of an ordinary Christian home, anywhere in the Spanish-speaking world? That's the question we have to answer now. And the answer starts in Armenia, in the exact moment Saint Bartholomew the Apostle gave his whole life for the faith he had spent years preaching, in faraway lands, among people who had never once heard the name of Jesus Christ. What happened in those distant lands, and what patristic tradition preserved in unusually raw and precise detail, is the exact origin of the object Saint Teresa of Jesus, flagged as a real warning for every August 24 that arrives on the Church's calendar. Armenia, the first century of the Christian era. Saint Bartholomew the Apostle arrives in this mountainous land after years spent preaching the gospel across remote regions of Asia. The oldest Christian tradition, passed down by Eusebius of Caesarea in his ecclesiastical history and later confirmed by other historians of the early church, places the end of Bartholomew's apostolic road here. King Astyages ruled the region with a hard hand at the time, a land of steep mountains and cold valleys, where Christianity had barely begun to take root among the people. His younger brother, Polemius, had embraced the true Christian faith through Bartholomew's preaching, and that fact set off a fury that would seal the apostle's fate for good. Astyages ordered his immediate capture without delay, driven by a deep fear of losing his people's full religious loyalty. The tradition preserved by later church writers, among them Saint Jerome and Saint Gregory of Tours, describes in careful detail what happened next in that remote corner of the empire. Saint Bartholomew was flayed alive, slowly, according to the oldest surviving account. That's the exact word patristic tradition preserved for centuries, passed faithfully from one generation of Christians to the next, among those who venerated this brave apostle as one of the early church's most admired martyrs. The instrument used for that martyrdom was a knife, a flaying knife, similar to the ones used throughout the region at the time for working cured animal hides. An everyday, domestic object, something present in nearly any home of that era, suddenly turned into the weapon of a martyrdom the whole church still remembers with reverence. Saint Gregory of Tours, in his monastic writings from the 6th century, describes with sober detail how Bartholomew endured that terrible suffering with a steadiness that deeply moved everyone who witnessed it that day. He stayed silent when given the chance to negotiate his faith, holding on to, until his very last moment, the same firmness that had carried him through years of preaching in lands far from his own homeland. Tradition adds that after the flaying, Bartholomew was also beheaded, closing out a complete martyrdom that later Christian art would depict for centuries, with one precise, unsettling image: the apostle holding his own flayed skin in his hands, the way Michelangelo painted him in the Last Judgment on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, many centuries after his death. That image, so raw and direct to modern sensibilities, didn't come out of the Renaissance simply to shock the viewer. It came straight out of patristic tradition, out of accounts that circulated for centuries among Christian communities who needed to remember, in full, exactly how far this apostle's love for Christ had carried him. And here is the exact point where the martyrdom and the object fuse permanently in Christian memory. The flaying knife, the actual instrument of that ordeal, became over the centuries the official iconographic attribute of Saint Bartholomew the Apostle. In churches, in altarpieces, on the devotional prints that circulated through Spain and across Catholic Europe, Bartholomew appears holding exactly that knife, the visible symbol of his total surrender. Spanish popular piety, always attentive to the symbolic detail of every saint and every venerated martyr, took up that attribute with real, almost solemn seriousness. A knife tied directly to an apostle's martyrdom, an object that visually represented the exact moment of greatest suffering and greatest fidelity to Christ, took on over the slow passage of centuries a spiritual weight that went well past its role as a simple image in an altarpiece or a print. Saint Teresa of Jesus, raised in 16th century Spain, formed in a spirituality that took the iconography of the saints and the symbolism of their attributes very seriously, knew this tradition well. In her writing on spiritual discernment, particularly in the book of her life, she repeatedly stresses the importance of paying attention to signs, to objects, to the spaces that surround a Christian's life of prayer. She understood that an object carrying such an intense and deep symbolism, so directly tied to a martyr's extreme suffering, couldn't be treated with the same casualness as any other kitchen tool. And that understanding of hers, documented in specific passages of her work, is exactly the root of the warning that has come down to us tied to August 24th. But there's something more Saint Teresa of Jesus saw in prayer about this particular apostle, something that goes well beyond the simple symbolism of the flaying knife. Something she herself described in words that strike readers with their unusual precision. Words that have to do directly with what happens in the spiritual world on the night of his feast, when the whole church remembers the sacrifice of a man who gave his entire skin for Christ, without condition and without holding anything back. That moment of prayer, that instant when Saint Teresa of Jesus understood something beyond the simple iconographic tradition, is what gives full meaning to the warning she left in writing. What she perceived had an active, present character, a spiritual reality that repeated itself every year on this exact date, touching directly the life of any Christian home that let its guard down. And that perception of hers, so characteristic of her particular way of praying, so full of that extraordinary ability she had to see the spiritual hidden inside the everyday, is exactly what we need to understand now, calmly, before moving forward toward the concrete warning she left in writing for every Christian household on this exact night of the liturgical year. Why did an apostle flayed with an ordinary work knife end up centuries after his death as a patron against the evil one and against the sudden storms that shake the fields in the middle of summer? What connection could possibly exist between a martyrdom that happened in Armenia almost 2,000 years ago, in faraway, mountainous, remote lands, and the dark, heavy clouds that so many Spanish farmers still watch with old wariness every August 24th, year after year, generation after generation? Most of them no longer remembering why. The answer starts with something Catholic theology has always held firmly, with total doctrinal clarity since the earliest councils. A martyr's power doesn't end with his physical death on earth. The Church has taught since her earliest centuries that the blood poured out for Christ unites martyrs in a very special way to the final victory over evil and sin. Bartholomew, who literally gave up his entire naked skin for that faith without condition or reserve, holds a particular place within that communion of saints, a place reserved for those who endured the most extreme suffering possible without yielding for a single instant. So how did Spanish popular piety come to link his feast specifically to protecting the home from the evil one? The answer has deep roots in several traditions that slowly wove together over the centuries. In many regions of Spain, especially rural areas of Castile and Aragon, August 24th traditionally marked the end of the harshest summer heat, the exact point when what people called the storms of Saint Bartholomew began. Sudden violent tempests that farmers in those lands attributed to an invisible struggle between good and evil playing out precisely on this date on the calendar. Why this exact date, and not some other one on the Church's broad liturgical calendar? Popular tradition answered with a simple logic, deeply rooted in collective memory. If a saint had given his entire skin to extreme suffering out of love for Christ, that same saint carried full spiritual authority to face down the forces working against man, including the invisible forces of the evil one that, according to the oldest popular piety, tried to use this particular night of the year to move more freely against households that let their guard down. This belief, far from being an isolated superstition with no doctrinal foundation, finds direct, verifiable echo in the Church's constant teaching on the power of the saints' intercession before the throne of God. The Catechism reminds us clearly that the saints, already united to the full glory of God, intercede continually for those of us still on pilgrimage here on earth, and that this intercession has real, verifiable effects in the lives of those who call on it with true, persevering faith. And what does all this have to do with the knife, with that concrete, everyday object that turned up as the instrument of his martyrdom in Armenia? Here is the central question that now finally demands a full, direct answer. Because in Spanish popular piety, the same object that became, over time, Saint Bartholomew's official iconographic attribute, the same knife that appears in his devotional images and prints, ended up tied, over the slow passage of generations, to a very specific prohibition for the exact night of his annual feast. What exactly is that prohibition passed down through so many generations? Tradition, carried orally from grandmothers to granddaughters for centuries across Spain and Latin America, holds firmly that leaving a knife out, visible, unput away, uncovered, through the whole night of August 24th, can become a kind of symbolic invitation to the forces that, precisely on this night, try to use the memory of the apostles' suffering to sow spiritual confusion inside a Christian home. Is this just simple country legend, one more custom piled onto the saints' calendar over time? The question deserves a serious, weighed answer, without falling either into automatic dismissal of anything popular or into naive superstition that treats an ordinary object as though it held magic power on its own, apart from faith and the grace of God. Saint Teresa of Jesus, a woman of truly extraordinary spiritual intelligence, never settled for simple, hasty explanations when it came to discerning what was happening in the invisible world surrounding a believer's life. She drew a careful, precise line between empty superstition, which the Church has always firmly condemned, and true spiritual discernment, the kind that recognizes how certain objects, certain gestures, certain specific dates can become points of particular attention in a Christian's daily life of prayer. What exactly did she come to understand about this particular apostle and this simple, everyday object? The answer doesn't sit in one isolated passage of her extensive written work. It's woven carefully through different writings of hers, through deep reflections on the discernment of spirits, on the ongoing vigilance a Christian home requires, and on how much the sacramentals actually matter against the enemy of soul's persistent attacks. That understanding of hers, so concrete, so far from any empty, superstitious fantasy, is exactly what we now need to look at closely, because in it lies the full key to the warning Saint Teresa of Jesus left in her own hand for every Christian household preparing to live through this night of August 24th with all the spiritual seriousness it deserves. Picture the deep silence of the convent of the Incarnation in Avila just before dawn in the middle of a Castilian summer. The heat hasn't fully arrived yet, but the air already feels different, thick with that heavy dampness that signals a storm is close. Saint Teresa of Jesus is in prayer in her small, bare cell, hands folded, eyes closed, waiting for what she would later call one of those visits of the soul that can't be explained fully in ordinary human words. It's the exact eve of Saint Bartholomew's feast, one full day before the whole church solemnly celebrates his glorious martyrdom. And Saint Teresa of Jesus writes, in a passage faithfully preserved among her autobiographical writings, that she felt this apostle's presence with a very particular clarity, along with a concrete physical sensation. A sudden chill running down both her arms, followed almost at once by an interior image so sharp she described it in her own words, as though she was seeing it with the eyes of the body, and not only with the eyes of the soul. What appeared before her, as she carefully documented for her confessors and biographers, was the full figure of a man holding something between his two hands. And that something, she says with total clarity, gave off a strange glow, deeper than the simple shine of metal under the sun, as though the object itself carried inside it the living memory of the suffering that had made it sacred forever. In her writing on the discernment of spirits, particularly in passages from the interior castle, Saint Teresa of Jesus insists on something now central to understanding what she experienced that night. Objects that have been instruments of suffering for Christ, especially ones tied to an apostle's martyrdom, carry what she describes as a lasting spiritual mark. This is a firm theological conviction held by the Church for centuries, with nothing to do with magic or superstition. Matter can become a real vehicle of grace when it has been joined to a saint's sacrifice. But Saint Teresa of Jesus adds something more in that same passage, something that touches directly on the warning we're trying to understand. She writes that an object of a similar nature, present in a home carelessly, without proper spiritual attention, without blessing, without care, can become the opposite, a point of vulnerability, a crack through which something other than grace can try to slip in. This teaching isn't unique to that one passage of her work. It shows up again in different words and a different context in the book of her life, where she describes in detail her own experiences of discernment around objects, images, and spaces that at some point in her religious life stirred up a particular unease in her, an interior sensation she learned over time to tell apart from simple imagination, thanks to the patient guidance of her confessors and years of steady practice in contemplative prayer. Feel it now, for just a moment, the way she herself described it. The weight of the silence right before a storm, the sudden chill running down the arms, the absolute interior certainty that something concrete needed urgent, immediate attention. That's the exact moment Saint Teresa of Jesus came to understand, with a clarity she would later pass on in her teaching to the sisters of her convents. Why Saint Bartholomew's feast called for a particular conscious watchfulness over sharp objects present in every Christian home of the time. The knife, direct instrument of his martyrdom, an object forever tied to his sacred image in every church and every old altarpiece, becomes here a concrete example of something much broader Saint Teresa of Jesus taught over and over throughout her religious life: the constant need to discern carefully everything surrounding a home's spiritual life, especially on dates as heavy with meaning as this one. She speaks of something precise and concrete, not some vague or hazy fear. The very object that represents a martyr's extreme fidelity can, without proper spiritual attention, become the exact point where something else tries to feed off that same intense symbolic weight. A knife left out, unput away, unblessed, on the exact night the Church remembers an apostle's complete flaying, becomes for Saint Teresa of Jesus a space of real spiritual attention, carrying a weight very few Christians notice today at first glance. And here is the third thread we've been following patiently since the start of this story, the one asking what exact instrument is tied to this apostle's martyrdom, and why popular tradition carried that precise detail all the way into the contemporary Christian home. The full answer now stands in front of you, perfectly clear. The flaying knife, the same instrument that appears in every iconographic depiction of Saint Bartholomew across the centuries, the same one Spanish popular piety linked to the storms of this exact date, is precisely the object Saint Teresa of Jesus flagged as something to watch, to care for, to never leave out unattended on the night of August 24th. But knowing the exact object is only the beginning of everything left to understand. Now comes the part where we need to grasp what concrete action Saint Teresa of Jesus asks of every Christian listening carefully to this warning. What exact gesture needs to happen tonight before the sun goes down completely and the spiritual vigil the Church has tied to this Apostles' Feast for centuries begins? Get up right now, even if only for a brief moment, and go straight to your kitchen. Look carefully and slowly, not in passing, not in a hurry. Find every knife you have sitting out right now, on the marble counter, hanging on a magnetic strip on the wall, resting by the sink, forgotten on the table since the last family meal. Count calmly how many are in sight right now, one by one, without rushing through this small, simple walk through your own kitchen. That first gesture, so plain, so easy to do, is the actual starting point of everything Saint Teresa of Jesus taught about this exact date on the Church's liturgical calendar. Put each of those knives away calmly before night falls completely over your city on August 24th. Don't leave them out on any surface in your home. Set them inside a closed drawer, wrapped in a clean cloth if you can, out of sight of anyone who walks into your kitchen tonight. This gesture, inherited from generations of Spanish popular piety, honors, with a concrete act the soul can recognize, the suffering of an apostle who gave his entire skin for Christ, and closes off any symbolic crack that same object could represent if left out unattended. Pray while you do it. Don't turn this gesture into something mechanical, empty of real spiritual meaning. As you put each knife away, say quietly, out loud, or simply in your heart, a short and sincere prayer. Ask Saint Bartholomew, through the extreme fidelity he showed to his very last moment on earth, to protect your whole home from any spiritual confusion tonight and every night of the coming year. Bless your family's dinner table afterward. Take a little holy water if you have some at home, and sprinkle it over the exact spot where your family gathers to eat every day. If you don't have holy water on hand right now, you can ask your parish priest for some, or stop by the holy water font at your nearest parish before this day ends. This simple gesture, rooted in Catholic tradition for centuries, seals the central space of your home with the real protection only the Church can offer through her blessed sacramentals. Place a small crucifix, if you have one at home, near the entrance to your kitchen tonight. It doesn't need to be large or expensive in any way. A simple, humble crucifix, hung on the wall or set on a shelf where the whole family can see it, reminds the whole house that the final victory over any force set against God was already won by Christ on the cross. 2,000 years ago now, once and for all. Gather your family together if you can, before it gets fully dark. Explain to them in your own simple words why this particular night is different from the rest of the year. Tell them who Saint Bartholomew was, how he gave his entire life without condition for the faith he had spent years preaching in distant lands, and why Saint Teresa of Jesus thought it mattered to remember his martyrdom with a concrete gesture inside the Christian home. Children, especially the youngest ones in the house, remember faith better when they see it lived out in simple, repeatable gestures each year, not only heard in abstract words at Sunday Mass. Light a small candle, if your family tradition allows and wants it, specifically in honor of Saint Bartholomew the Apostle. Set it somewhere safe and stable, away from curtains or anything flammable nearby, and let it burn quietly while the rest of your family says a short prayer together before sitting down to dinner. This small flame, according to the oldest popular piety passed down across generations, symbolizes the Apostles' steady faithfulness, one that didn't go out even in the face of the most extreme suffering a human being can endure in this life. Pray before you go to sleep tonight for the souls in purgatory who at some point in their earthly lives overlooked this kind of spiritual vigilance without ever knowing it, with no bad intention at all, simply out of ignorance of a tradition that slowly faded from many Catholic homes over time. Ask for them with an open heart. Offer a full Our Father, a heartfelt Hail Mary, or whatever concrete prayer your own personal devotion moves you toward at this particular point in the night. Check, before you finally go to bed, that no knife has slipped back out of the drawer where you put it away earlier tonight. This last check, small as it seems, closes the full circle of spiritual vigilance Saint Teresa of Jesus taught as necessary for this exact date on the full liturgical calendar. It's a gesture of sincere attention, of real care, the same loving, steady watchfulness any mother keeps over her home when she knows for certain something important is at stake that particular night of the year. And tomorrow, when August 21st finally dawns, that simple act of care will have done its full, complete work. But before that peaceful sunrise, there's still something more important to understand. What specific sacramentals, what precise conditions make this protection work in a real, complete way inside your home, according to what the Church herself teaches, with authority about the true power of these sacred gestures handed down through the centuries. The Catholic Church recognizes and teaches 7 principal sacramentals a Christian home can use as concrete, verifiable spiritual protection throughout the liturgical year, and at least 4 of them connect directly to the warning Saint Teresa of Jesus left in writing for the particular night of Saint Bartholomew. The first of all is holy water, so simple in appearance and so powerful in its real spiritual effect. Blessed by a priest through a specific liturgical prayer of the Church, holy water carries, according to constant Catholic teaching, the power to drive off negative influences and sanctify concrete physical spaces. Using it correctly requires 3 things: that it was actually blessed by an ordained minister, that it's applied with conscious faith, and that it gets renewed from time to time, since its effectiveness always depends on the spiritual disposition of the person using it. Within the sacramental life of the Church, never has some isolated magic formula apart from faith. Second on the list is a crucifix, blessed with particular devotion by a parish priest. A crucifix that has received a priest's proper blessing becomes, according to constant Catholic doctrine, a visible, real presence of Christ's victory over every form of evil at work in the world. The conditions for its spiritual effectiveness include placing it somewhere visible and dignified in the family home, not lending it out carelessly to people outside the immediate family, and occasionally renewing a gesture of reverence toward it, whether through a short daily prayer or a simple reverent kiss when passing it each morning. Third is the Blessed Saint Benedict medal, ancient and effective. This particular medal engraved with the saint's own specific exorcism formula, functions as a concrete spiritual shield against the persistent attacks of the enemy of souls. The 4 conditions for using it correctly are these: that it was blessed with the specific minor exorcism formula that accompanies it according to the Roman ritual, that it's worn always with true faith and never as a simple decorative or fashionable amulet, that the intention of protection is consciously renewed from time to time, and that it's always combined with an active sacramental life, especially frequent confession and Sunday Eucharist received with sincere devotion. The 4th sacramental, especially relevant to this exact date on the calendar, is the prayer to Saint Michael the Archangel, composed with solemnity by Pope Leo XIII after a deeply documented mystical experience concerning the evil one's persistent attacks on the whole Church. This particular prayer, though not a physical object like the 3 sacramentals above, is one the Church expressly recommends for moments of particular spiritual vulnerability, and the night of Saint Bartholomew, carrying as it does all its symbolic weight around suffering and the cutting instrument of his martyrdom, fits exactly into that category. Saint Teresa of Jesus, in different passages of her work, written patiently over the years, insists that these sacramentals don't work automatically or purely mechanically, as though they were magic formulas independent of the believer's faith. She describes repeatedly how her own experience of demonic attacks over years of religious life led her, over time, to understand that holy water, a crucifix, the sign of the cross traced with devotion, always work together with the interior disposition of the soul that uses them with faith. A Christian who sprinkles holy water without any real faith behind it, as she herself wrote more than once, gets a very limited effect compared to someone who does it out of sincere, deep trust in Christ working through His Holy Church. The General Conditions Spiritual Theology sets for the correct use of any sacramental in the home number 5 in total, and it's worth going through them calmly before this night of August 24th ends. First condition: the sacramental must have received a valid, recognized priestly blessing, never self-consecrated by the believer without the Church's express authorization. Second condition: it must be used with conscious, wakeful intention, never as an empty gesture repeated without thinking about its real, deeper meaning. Third condition: it must always be combined with an active life of grace, especially frequent sacramental confession. Fourth condition: it must be renewed periodically over time, since neglected devotion slowly loses its intensity. Fifth condition: it must go hand in hand with a moral life consistent with the faith one professes publicly, because no sacramental ever replaces the human heart's interior conversion. Applying these 5 specific conditions to tonight's warning about the knife makes the whole picture much clearer for any Christian listening carefully. It's not enough to put the object away out of simple inherited habit done without thought. It needs to be put away with the conscious intention of honoring Bartholomew's complete martyrdom, combined with blessing the home through holy water blessed by a priest and sustained within an active Christian life that includes daily prayer and regular participation in the sacraments the Church generously offers each of her faithful. This is exactly the full ordered picture Saint Teresa of Jesus was trying to teach when she wrote in detail about the spiritual vigilance of the Christian home on dates as heavy with meaning as this one. It's an ordered set of concrete, verifiable gestures, entirely free of empty superstitious fear, held up by the Church's solid, firm doctrine, capable of turning any home into a truly protected space against whatever spiritual confusion the night of August 24th might bring each year. Maria Dolores just turned 63 this past summer. She lives in a small house with sun-worn red tiles in a quiet, peaceful town near Toledo with her husband, retired now for some time, and a small granddaughter who visits every long summer during the August school break. This exact night, the long-awaited August 24th, she did something she hadn't done in years. She emptied the whole dish rack of knives and put them away, one by one, with real care, in the largest drawer in her kitchen. She couldn't have told you exactly why she was doing it if you'd asked her directly. Her grandmother had done it every year without fail, with the same steady consistency, ever since Maria Dolores was a little girl. And she remembered the gesture fondly without ever having fully understood its deeper meaning. This morning, after hearing about Saint Bartholomew and the knife of his martyrdom during her parish priest's Sunday homily, something clicked inside her, like a key finally fitting the right lock. She went home that same morning with a determination she hadn't felt in years toward a tradition that seemed, on the surface, so simple. She carefully blessed the dining table with holy water she'd kept for years in a small bottle near the crucifix in the hallway. She placed a small white candle next to an old prayer card of Saint Bartholomew that had come down from her own mother, a card yellowed with age, kept for decades in the back of a drawer without anyone paying it much attention until now. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, she took it out gently and set it where the whole family could see it clearly during dinner. Her small granddaughter, barely 9 years old, asked her, curious, why she was doing all this tonight in particular. Maria Dolores told her, in words simple enough for her age, the story of the apostle who gave his entire skin for Christ, without over-dramatizing the story, but without softening it too much either. The girl listened with wide eyes, full of sincere, genuine wonder, carefully touched the yellowed prayer card with her small hands, and then asked if they could pray together before bed for that brave saint who had suffered so much out of love for Christ. They prayed together, calmly. A simple Our Father, said slowly, word by word, hands folded on the already cleared kitchen table, while outside the distant rumble of a summer storm began to rise, the kind that arrives suddenly after several days of stifling heat with not a single drop of rain over the dry fields. Maria Dolores felt, while praying with her granddaughter, hands folded together, something she couldn't have fully explained if someone had asked her the next day. A different kind of calm, deeper than her usual quiet summer nights. A clear sense that the small gesture she'd made that evening, putting away a few knives, lighting a simple candle, blessing a family table, carried a spiritual weight that went far beyond anything her hands had physically touched that August afternoon. That same exact night, in another house a few miles away, a younger woman named Rocio was getting ready for bed, having never once heard of this particular tradition. Her kitchen, modern, bright, perfectly organized down to the last detail, had a full block of shiny stainless steel knives sitting on the granite counter, clearly visible from the front door itself. She hadn't given it a single thought all evening. For her, August 24th was a day like any other on the calendar, nothing setting it apart from the other hot days of a summer that was already nearly over. This scene, repeated 1,000 different ways in thousands of Catholic homes every year, is exactly the contrast Saint Teresa of Jesus was trying to point to with the warning she left in writing over 4 centuries ago. It offers, to anyone willing to receive it with a truly open heart, without ever judging someone who still knows nothing of the tradition, and without stirring up fear in anyone who's never heard of it before, a concrete, practical spiritual tool inherited from generations of sincere Catholic piety, capable of turning a small household gesture, like putting away a simple knife, into a deep act of conscious, real faith. The main thread we opened calmly at the start of this story, the question of what exact object shouldn't be left out in your house tonight, is by now almost fully answered. We know for certain it's the knife. We also know why. Bartholomew's complete martyrdom, the flaying suffered with that same cutting instrument, the symbolic weight faithfully carried through centuries. We know just as clearly what to do about it. Put it away with conscious intention, bless the family table, light a simple candle, pray together as a family before going to sleep. But one last essential piece remains, the one that closes the whole circle Saint Teresa of Jesus traced with her own written warning. We still need to understand the final defining connection between this brave apostle's martyrdom knife and the real spiritual protection of your home on this exact feast of the liturgical calendar. Something she herself summed up with a clarity that surprises anyone reading it for the first time, centuries after she wrote it with her own trembling hand in the quiet of her cell. Saint Teresa of Jesus summed up this whole deep teaching in one specific line that has reached us through her writing, passed faithfully from generation to generation among those who study her complete work carefully and with real devotion. She wrote, with precision, that an object marked by a martyr's profound suffering, when kept with sincere faith and honored with conscious intention, becomes a spiritual shield for the whole household. And when it's carelessly neglected, left out with no awareness at all of what it represents, that same object loses its protective power and becomes vulnerable to what the Church has always precisely called the confusion of the enemy of souls. This teaching, so simple on its surface, but so deep underneath, holds a spiritual truth that runs through centuries of sustained Catholic piety. Matter isn't neutral in the face of the spiritual world around it. An object can carry real, true grace when it's joined, through firm tradition and sincere faith, to a particular saint's sacrifice. And that same object can turn, without anyone noticing at a glance, into a point of neglect the moment a Christian completely forgets the deep symbolic weight it has carried for centuries. Saint Bartholomew the Apostle's martyrdom knife is exactly that concrete, precise case. Instrument of a flaying endured with truly extraordinary and admirable steadiness in the faraway remote lands of Armenia, an iconographic attribute venerated for centuries in the altarpieces and prints of the whole Western Christian world, an everyday, simple object, humble and familiar in appearance, present in every kitchen of every Catholic home in the world without exception. The distance between the sacred and the purely domestic in this exact particular case is much shorter than most Christians today would imagine at first. Saint Teresa of Jesus saw it with total clarity because she herself lived her whole life paying close attention to objects, to spaces, to the small gestures surrounding her daily life of prayer inside the convent. She taught the sisters of her community to discern these spiritual realities out of pure, real love. Love for Christ, crucified. Love for the saints who gave their entire lives for Him without condition. Love for the Christian home as a sacred space that deserves the same steady attention given to one's own soul. August 24th, the solemn feast of Saint Bartholomew the Apostle, ends up being much more then than a simple date marked on the Catholic Church's vast liturgical calendar. It's a sincere yearly invitation, repeated without fail every single year, to look at your own house the way Saint Teresa of Jesus looked at hers, with attentive, awake eyes, eyes that calmly discern the spiritual hidden inside the everyday, eyes that understand deeply that faith is also lived out in small gestures, in the concrete objects we touch every day without giving much thought to their real meaning. Putting away a simple knife tonight won't change anyone's eternal destiny by itself, magically or automatically. But the simple gesture of putting it away with conscious intention, of blessing the family table, of praying together as a family, of remembering the full sacrifice of an apostle who gave his entire skin for the true faith, is part of that conscious, awake Christian life Saint Teresa of Jesus taught through her own example her entire life. A watchful life, truly awake, that never lets daily routine dull the living memory of the sacred that surrounds us every day. The main thread we opened so calmly at the beginning of this whole story is now fully closed, with nothing left loose. From the very first moment you started listening to this story with attention, you knew something in your house might be leaving open a door you would never have opened on purpose. Now you know, with complete clarity, exactly what object it is, why it matters so much, what to do with it tonight on August 24th, and what specific sacramentals hold up that spiritual protection with the full solidity of the Church's firmest doctrine. Saint Bartholomew the Apostle, who gave his entire bare skin without yielding for a single instant before the most extreme suffering a man can endure, intercedes today, just as he interceded for centuries, for every Christian home that remembers his martyrdom with true, sincere faith. Saint Teresa of Jesus, who saw him in deep prayer and understood the real spiritual weight of that knife passed down through generations, left her warning in writing as a genuine gift, not a heavy burden. A simple, humble gesture any Christian of goodwill can carry out this very night, without any fear, without empty superstition, with the calm, firm certainty that God protects whoever watches with real love over their own home. May that knife tonight in your own household be put away with the same sincere reverence you'd give something truly sacred. May your whole table be well blessed with sincere devotion. May your whole family united remember, even for one brief instant, the name of an apostle who gave absolutely everything he had for Christ, holding nothing back. And may Saint Teresa of Jesus, from the place where she now contemplates God face to face for all eternity, intercede for you and yours on this particular feast of Saint Bartholomew, while the night of August 24th settles slowly over your house with the deep peace that only true faith can offer a heart that keeps watch with love. Now you know it all. You know what object Saint Teresa of Jesus held in the quiet of her memory for decades before writing it down. You know why a knife, something so small, so ordinary, so present in every kitchen in the world, became the center of a spiritual warning passed down through centuries of Catholic piety. You know where it comes from. A flaying endured with a steadiness that almost 2,000 years later still moves anyone who knows the full story of Saint Bartholomew the Apostle. And you know, too, what to do with what you've just learned. Not as a heavy obligation, not as one more task added to an already full day. You know what to do the way someone receives a small gift from someone who loved them deeply centuries ago. Put the knife away with intention, bless the table with holy water, light a simple candle, gather your family, even for just a few minutes before bed, and speak the name of an apostle who gave everything he had without holding back a thing for himself. Staying with this story all the way through wasn't an accident. Something in you recognized from the start that this wasn't just another date on the calendar. Something in you sensed that the question this story opened with, about a door that might be open without your knowing it, deserved a complete answer, not a half one. That answer is in your hands now. And with it, something even more valuable. The calm certainty that Saint Teresa of Jesus, a woman who discerned the spiritual hidden in the everyday with such clarity, thought of you, of your house, of your family, when she wrote this warning down more than 4 centuries ago. She wasn't thinking of some abstract reader or a faceless crowd. She was thinking of every particular person who, centuries later, would sit down to hear this story on an August night much like this one. That's the promise this night keeps. A spiritual inheritance that brings peace, free of fear. The peace of knowing your home tonight can be a little more protected, a little more aware, a little closer to that loving vigilance Saint Teresa of Jesus kept her whole life over every space, every object, every gesture surrounding her own life consecrated to God. Staying with this story to the end was, in itself, a quiet act of true faith. And that quiet act has already begun bearing fruit in your heart, even if you don't fully feel it yet tonight. There's something you may not know yet about the last years of Saint Teresa of Jesus' life. Something very few people know, even among those who've read her major works, because it stayed documented in lesser-known sources, in letters and testimonies from her own sisters in community, in details, official history, tends to leave aside in favor of the big events of her life. During the final months of her life on earth, traveling between foundations along the dusty roads of Castile, already sick, worn down by decades of relentless work, Saint Teresa of Jesus kept stopping in every town to ask about local traditions, about the popular devotions of each region she passed through. She wasn't doing it out of simple scholarly curiosity. She did it because she understood something many mystics of her time never grasped with the same depth. The faith of simple people, passed from grandmother to granddaughter across generations without any need for complex theological treatises, often held a spiritual wisdom worth listening to with attention and respect. That same attitude of hers, so typical of the way she approached faith, is exactly what's inviting you today to look at your own home with new eyes. Because the warning about Saint Bartholomew's knife isn't the only teaching Saint Teresa of Jesus left tied to concrete objects in the Christian home. Across the liturgical year, on every important feast, on every date marked by the memory of a saint or a mystery of the faith, she observed and passed on similar gestures, similar warnings, similar protections that very few Catholics today know about in full. Think about everything you still don't know. Think about the other dates on the calendar that hold, without your suspecting it yet, teachings similar to the one you just received tonight. Every one of those dates is a different door into the same spiritual wisdom you touched tonight while hearing about Saint Bartholomew and his martyrdom knife. Each one holds a concrete gesture, a concrete protection, a concrete way of honoring God and his saints that popular piety kept passing down generation after generation until it reached, changed but faithful at its core, our own days. There's something in human nature that looks for patterns, for meaning, for connections between the different moments of the year. And Saint Teresa of Jesus, with her extraordinary spiritual intelligence, understood that human impulse as something to point rightly toward God, rather than a flaw to root out. Every feast, every date, every anniversary of a martyrdom or a mystery of the faith became for her a renewed opportunity for examination, for vigilance, for real spiritual growth. You, who made it to the end of this story about Saint Bartholomew, who now know how to put your knife away with intention and bless your table with faith, have already taken the first step on a much longer road. A road Saint Teresa of Jesus walked her whole life, date after date, saint after saint, learning to read her own house, her own convent, her own entire life, like a spiritual map full of signs only an attentive heart knows how to read correctly. That spiritual map still exists today, centuries after her death. It's still waiting for anyone willing to learn to read it with the same attention she gave to every gesture, every object, every date on her own personal calendar of devotion. And every new story you hear about her, every new teaching you discover tied to her life and spiritual doctrine, is one more step along that same map she left, traced out for anyone willing to follow it with an open heart. Think for a moment about how many dates pass by you each year without your knowing what they hold inside. How many saints' feasts, how many anniversaries, how many moments on the liturgical calendar hide, without your suspecting it, a teaching similar to the one you just received tonight about Saint Bartholomew and his martyrdom knife. How many warnings, how many protections, how many concrete gestures Saint Teresa of Jesus documented in her own hand are still waiting somewhere in her work for someone to discover them and bring them back into the daily life of a Christian home today. That sincere curiosity you feel right now, that clear sense that there's more still to discover, isn't an accident. It's the very same spiritual restlessness that led Saint Teresa of Jesus to ask town after town, road after road, about the traditions her contemporaries kept without always being able to explain their full origin. That same restlessness, that same hunger to understand more deeply what faith carries through the centuries, is what's inviting you now to keep exploring, to keep listening, to keep discovering what's still left to learn about this extraordinary woman who saw so clearly what the rest of the world could barely sense. Don't let tonight be just one isolated moment. Let it be the start of a different kind of attention toward the calendar that shapes your own life of faith. Because right there, in every date you don't fully know yet, in every saint's feast you may have celebrated without knowing its deeper meaning, there's a teaching waiting, kept for centuries, for someone like you to finally hear it with a ready heart. Before I say goodbye tonight, I want to leave you with an image Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote in one of her last writings, not long before she died. She said that the soul who watches with love over its own house, over the objects that fill it, over the gestures that sustain it day after day, is a soul that has already begun building within itself the dwelling place where God wants to live. Tonight, when you put the knife away, when you bless your table, when you pray with your family before bed, may you feel that you're not alone in that gesture. Saint Bartholomew the Apostle, who gave his entire skin for Christ almost 2,000 years ago, walks with you tonight in a quiet but real way. And Saint Teresa of Jesus, who saw with such clarity what you've come to understand tonight, walks with you too, from the place where she now rests in the peace of God. Go now, with all the calm you need, and get your house ready for tonight. There's no rush, no urgency in what I'm asking of you. Only the quiet certainty that a small gesture, done in faith, carries a weight eternity recognizes, even when our human eyes don't always see it clearly. May Saint Bartholomew the Apostle intercede powerfully for you and yours tonight. May his fidelity to his very last moment inspire you to live your own faith with that same devotion, even in small gestures, even in something as simple as putting away a knife and lighting a candle on an ordinary night in August. And may Saint Teresa of Jesus, mother and teacher to so many souls across the centuries, bless you tonight from heaven, walk with you through every corner of your home, and remind you always that true faith is lived out as much in life's biggest decisions as in the smallest, quietest gestures of the home. May the deep peace of Christ dwell in your home tonight and always. Amen.